Hi there, visual storytellers. Today I begin a series of 4 lectures on the principles of design and layout. CARP, contrast, alignment, repetition, and proximity. All of these are covered in your textbook, the Non-Designer's Design Book, but I'm going to expand on those and help you understand how to use these principles to improve your designs. Today I start with contrast. You can see my opening slide has the word contrast in small white type on a black background. This demonstrates the principle of using a light color on a dark background, but it also demonstrates something else, and that is size. How if you have something that is a small size, but in this case is white or light, you can put it on a dark background and it will still stand out. Many people think that using contrast means only using things that are big, and big is certainly one way to get contrast, but it's not the only way. Here I have an ad. It's a brilliant ad for an obviously ancient iPod because nobody uses iPods like this anymore. But let's talk about how contrast is used in this layout. First of all, we have the silhouetted background of the woman. Because the background is a silhouette, it stands out on the green background. However, the green background and the black silhouette are somewhat close together in terms of what we call saturation. The colors are different, but the weight of the colors is similar. However, the white of the iPod really stands out. And so what the designer was thinking is they wanted the viewer to see the white first. The white is the most important because, of course, that's what it's advertising. It focuses your attention on the thing being advertised, which is the iPod. So because we see these white earbuds and we see the white iPod and also the white logo, it visually links these elements together. So your eye moves around through the layout in the circular manner. If the iPod if the logo had been in a different color, the logo would not have been so clearly visually linked to what is being advertised. The job of contrast is to create relationships between the elements of your design. So as I talked about in this previous ad, using white for the logo and of course for the iPod visually links these elements using contrast. So contrast creates relationships between the elements of your design, and so what it's doing is it's telling the viewer what is most important. That's the thing you have to remember when you're using contrast. Contrast says, look at me first. Keep that in mind as you're working on your posters and your type design on those posters, as well as on your infographic. How to get contrast? Well, there are a lot of ways to get it with color, and I'm not going to go through all of them so you won't be overwhelmed, but I'm going to focus on, I think, 3 different ways to get contrast with color. One, opposites on the color wheel. Remember from your color lectures that opposites on the color wheel are complementary colors. Here you can see we're using the complementary colors of red and green. If you use these together in a layout, it will draw attention to those elements. If you used just these colors, though, in abundance, because those colors, even though they're different, they are the same kind of density of color. It would confuse the eye, but generally, colors that are opposite on the color wheel have more contrast than colors that are side by side on the color wheel. Here we have an example of a logo that is using complementary colors. We're using the complementary colors of, okay, this isn't a good example of the color wheel, but orange and blue. We've got blue for the background and this part of the logo, and then its opposite on the color wheel, orange. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that they are also using, as you'll notice, they're separating these colors with white. So this goes back to what I was saying about how opposites, if only used together, might not create enough contrast. But by using white in addition to the complementary colors, these two sections of the logo stand out. Now you can see here that they've put the "the" in orange. Because this is a small amount of type and the "the" is not the most important thing, the fact that there really isn't huge contrast between the blue and the orange isn't really a problem. But if this were all blue and this were orange, this would not be as effective. So we're putting white type on top of the colors to make the type stand out. This relates to another way to get color, and that is value. Remember from your lecture that value is essentially how light or dark a color is. Value is not just different colors. So here, and keep in mind that a high value color is a light color and a low value color is a dark color. So light, high, dark, low. Here we have a low value blue and a high value, well, teal, I guess, and a high value blue. They create contrast. Here we have this low value brown and this high value peach. They create contrast. Here we have a low value blue and a light value yellow. So one way to visualize this is imagine that you took this image and you ran it through a black and white color copier. If you ran that through a black and white color copier, what would happen? What would happen is these lower value colors would get darker. They would look black or closer to black on the black and white color copier. These would look closer to white. And I think that if you try to visualize this with the colors that you use, it will be easier for you to see whether you have contrast in colors. So talking about value and going back to this example, this is a low value, this is a low value color. It's a blue. But this is also a low value orange. Maybe that's a little bit harder to visualize, but if you ran this through a black and white color copier, think about how that would come out. These colors, these would look almost the same in black and white. So we know that these are both low value colors, even though orange, when we think about orange, we think of it as being a bright color. In terms of its value, it's actually low value. Now, if you put a lot of white in here and made it closer to peach, this would become a higher value color. So this is how we get contrasting values. Here's an example of an ad using a low value background the photograph is low value. It's dark. And the type, which is white, white is very high value. There's no color there. So that high value white stands out very well on a low value background. This example enables you to, when you think about this example, just think in terms, as I've talked about value, put light on dark, or dark on light. And keep in mind that prompt I gave you about visualizing something if you ran it through a color copier. If you ran it through a black and white copier, and how those colors would come out. If I ran this through a copier in black and white, this would be dark and this would be very light. Similar to color is saturation. Saturation also has to do with how light and dark colors look. You can see that this is a very saturated color, and this is a color that's desaturated. So looking at this in terms of contrasting saturation, we have high contrast here because we have a saturated color on a desaturated color, and we have low contrast here because we have a saturated color on black, and we have a desaturated color on black. And notice the difference. These colors it would be very difficult to see gray type on a black background. However, you can see the saturated red more easily on a black background. Here's an example of an ad using a saturated red on an desaturated photograph that's black and white. Well, it's actually kind of a green toned photo. So the type stands out very clearly on top of the photo. You could also think of this as being low value. This is a low value color versus a high value color. So a dark color versus a light color. And see the white, this is a definite example of a high value color. It's white. Another way to get contrast, obviously, is size. Big versus little. Here's an example of that in play from a photo spread, Why I Blog. The type is very, very big, and it draws your attention. Notice how, if we're talking about color value, even though this is black and white, we have this very high value. We have white on top of a low value picture. If this type had been in black, we wouldn't be able to see the word blog the way we can now. Here we have another great example of size. This is a photo spread from Popular Mechanics. It is a story about, as it says, when they're not cheerleading, a group of current and former NFL and NBA cheerleaders work as scientists, researchers, doctors, and engineers. And they are teaching the next generation, if they can do it, anyone can. So by making this type large, your attention goes there first on this page. Actually, our attention is always drawn to photos first. You should know that. That in terms of contrast, if you place a photo on a page, that is generally where the viewer's attention is going to go first. But in terms of type, this large type provides a very strong contrast to the smaller type. And notice too what I talked about in terms of complementary colors. We have an orange outline on around a blue background. So that type is framed with contrast, which also makes it stand out, with complementary colors, which makes that type stand out even more. A mistake, and I'll show you an example in a resume in a second, a mistake that a lot of beginning designers make is they can't actually see big versus small. They might make a typeface in the designer's mind, they've made it bigger. But when we talk about contrast, do not, as your book author says, don't be a wimp. If you're going to do size contrast, do size contrast. Don't do 12-point type and 16-point type. Do 12-point type and 40-point type. That's contrast. Generally speaking, if there are only a few points difference in type size between two different areas of type on your page, if there's only 3 or 4 or 5 points difference in that size, that is not sufficient contrast. This is probably 36-point type. This is probably 100-point type, and we've got 2 lines of it. Well, actually, this is even bigger. This type is even bigger than this type. So that is very dramatic contrast. Another way to get it from type, of course, is to use contrasting categories of type, which we've talked about again and again. You can also do contrasting weights. So remember, your book author talks about what Concord is. Concord is using different versions of the same typeface. So Futura Bold versus Futura Light, or Times New Roman Bold versus Times Regular. Those are contrasting weights of font. Here we have a bold slab serif, right, with a sans serif. So 2 different categories as well as 2 different weights. The rest of my examples are just different categories. Old style serif with a modern serif, old style serif with a slab serif, and an old style serif with a sans serif font. Here's an example too of using different weights. Here we have equal visual weight. Think for a second, why are these equal? Well, obviously both of them are black, which makes them equal. But look at the type choices. These are the same size, and also they're both bold. This is Bodoni Poster, and this is a bold sans serif font. So yeah, you see this as a unit, you see Big Sale as a unit, but big isn't really contrasted from the word sale. Now we have intentional visual weight. We've made big in a big, bold Bodoni Poster font. We've also put it in red. We've made sale in a lighter weight sans serif font. So we're contrasting categories of type here, right? Bodoni Poster, which is a decorative font with a sans serif. We're contrasting color as well, but we're also creating difference in visual weight by using color and by using a bolder font and a less bold font. So the question arises, how big does something have to be, and how bold does it have to be to produce contrast? And the answer is, that depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on the function of the document and the size of the document. Here is an example I've created from a resume. Now, this is an example of something with very low contrast. Look at this for a second and ask yourself, where does your eye go first? Well, even without sufficient type contrast, your eye goes up here. And I'll tell you why in a minute. It's partly placement and it's something else, which I will explain in a second. But there is no contrast, even though these are two different typefaces. You see that? We have a sans serif and we have a serif font. Even though these are two different categories of type, there still isn't sufficient contrast because the weights are the same. So remember that I said contrast helps create relationships between the elements on the page. And there's no real relationship between the elements because of a lack of contrast. Now, look at this version. So I went in and I took this same sans serif font and I bolded it. Now you see this first because of contrast and placement. But then where does your eye go? Remember, contrast is creating relationships. The name, you follow the name down through the headings. And you follow your eye follows through on the headings because of the boldface. I'll back up to this one again. You see how that doesn't happen here? And how intuitively it happens here, just by using contrasting weight as well as font. And how it creates relationships by moving your eye from the name to the headings. This is also creating hierarchy. Remember, I said contrast says, look at me first. So for one thing, because of the bold font and the placement up in the corner, your eye goes here. On a resume, what is the most important thing? It's your name. But as I said, size is relative. This is a resume. This is an 8.5 by 11 document. Even though this is small-ish, your eye goes here. Sharon Bass does not need to be in gigantic type across the top of the resume. Now, if you go find templates online for resumes, what you'll see is there are a lot where the name is big, and that's a design choice. That's fine. But it doesn't have to be big to create contrast. So size is relative to the size of the document. It's very important that the role also that contrast plays in creating a sense of hierarchy. This is first the most important thing, and then next are these headings. They're the most important. And then as your eye moves down through here, you see relationships. You see the actual education and the jobs that my fictional Sharon Bass has. An example of another resume made by a student many years ago. You can see the issue here with contrast. You do see Peyton's name because Peyton's name is bigger than everything else. But all of these fonts, there's no contrast within these sections. So everything weighs the same. If Peyton had just put these in boldface and her name in boldface, she would have created the same kinds of relationships that you see evident in this resume, where your eye goes from this name down through the headings. So visualize this with boldface fonts. Now, she made this in an era where writing in lowercase was like the rage. We don't really do that anymore, and that's okay. But it doesn't really matter because just bolding, using a bold version of this font, would have created sufficient contrast. She's using one typeface on here. And not just one typeface, but one version of one typeface and just changing size. And so that's the issue here. If she had used Concord and she had used just different weights, bold and not bold of this font, then there would have been sufficient contrast. So the takeaway here on this is contrast doesn't mean that something has to be big. Big can be great under the right circumstances, but it's not the only way that you get contrast. You also get contrast from weight. Backing up one more time to this example of weight, right? So here we have very different weight because of boldness and color, but not necessarily because of size. Want to get intention even more? Put your name and these headings in a color, and they're going to stand out. Now, especially if you use a bright color like red or orange, as opposed to, say, a navy blue, in which you would still get the benefits of contrast, but you wouldn't see the color contrast so much. And last but not least, you get contrast by using white space. White space plays a crucial role in contrast. So what you need to remember is space around an element, i.e. type or a block of type, draws attention to that element. This is a super hard concept for beginning designers to wrap their mind around. White space is intentional, and you have to think about the fact that you're doing it. This is white space, but it doesn't have the same impact as this white space does, because you see how this white space drives your attention to the references and also to the address. Same with this. This white space, which I know there's just an impulse that beginning designers have to fill all the space on the page and also to space things out evenly. I'm going to talk more about this when I talk about the concept of proximity. White space also plays a very strong, an essential role in the concept of proximity, but it also plays a very important role in contrast. So here we can see this is like a very basic, the differences here seem very small, and yet they're big. Here we have too little white space. We don't have margins around the outside of the document. We don't have space between the headline and the subhead. We don't have space between the subhead and the photo. We don't have space between the photo and the author's name. So you see what happens with these seemingly small changes of adding good spacing and margins, how that little amount of white space creates contrast and also signals relationships. We look at this and we don't know, does this go with this and this? Here we understand intuitively that these two go together and this goes together. I keep using this word intuitive, and that's the thing about great design, is it makes your design intuitive for the viewer. By making things smaller and putting space between them, you create contrast by grouping those elements. Here, the designer has grouped these elements by putting white space between them. And here we have an ancient newsletter from the 90s. I'm still using it because I don't have examples. It's hard to find great examples of before and after. But this is still a really valid example of what happens when you use all of the elements of contrast that I was talking about. We look at the first version, and you notice how no white space. The designer has done what designers often want to do, and they have filled all the space. We have Running Man because he's racing for new standards. He's running at us. And because it's an image, like a photograph, our attention goes here first. Remember though, contrast says, look at me first. This is the most important thing on the page. Do you think that this little running man is the most important thing on this page? I don't think so. You might argue that this headline is most important, or that the name of the report is most important. Wigand is the name of the person who creates the newsletter. And people pay, now they're online, but these are proprietary reports and people pay a lot of money for them. So Wigand, he's the dude with the credibility. And because he's the dude with the credibility, he's making the report. He's the expert. His name perhaps should stand out. In this version, well, we've made the name big, but because we have all these other things, and we're talking about relative type size, right? These sizes, not that much different. No white space, not between elements, and no breathing room to group elements and tell the viewer what's most important. We don't really have any contrast here. Let's look at the after. Well, white space, white space, white space. So that white space creates contrast and creates a unit here of these two columns of text. The white space here separates these. So you understand this is at the top of the page and it's most important. And we've used contrasting color, Wigand, to make the name of the expert who writes this newsletter stand out. So we have different color values, right? Contrasting color. We have white space to make this stand out most importantly, and also placement at the top of the page. And we have a differential size, but still this is bigger than this font. So your eye goes from here to here to the T, which pulls your eye into the start of the article. And we've got white space to unify these elements and tell you what's most important. Okay, now I hope you understand contrast. You will understand contrast even better if you start looking at examples of layouts online and paying attention to what creates contrast in that layout. How is size used? How is color used? And how is white space used?